it's you can see the video on YouTube.
Perfect.
And we should be good to start.
All right, then let's get started. First things first, thank you so much for being patient with us while we were struggling so much with technology. It is consistently our worst enemy every single time we do this. But hello, everyone. My name is Callie Siplin, and I am one of the graduate assistants for Comms 111 Debate Research Practicum, which is also known as the Sacramento State Debate Team. And I am going to be your moderator for this event. So I do want to say thank you, of course, to our panelists, who I will be introducing in a moment. And thank you also to our audience, who will be slowly coming in, I'm sure, as you mentioned above, technical issues. But thank you all so much for joining us for our biannual Sac State Debate sponsored event. So for those of you who weren't aware, the debate team here at Sac State puts on a public forum or public debate event every semester as a way to educate the campus and as a way to bring attention to our award-winning debate team. Before we introduce our topic for this evening and our panelists, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the debate team. First, I wanted to thank all of our lovely debate coaches who make our team successful and help the public forum run as smooth as it can, which is still a little like Rocky Road ice cream. It's still a little bumpy, but hey, a little smooth is better than nothing. In addition, I'd like to take a minute to just brag about our debate team this year. They managed to win 11th in the national tournament, had two competitors who made it to an elimination round in Extempt and Lincoln Douglas debate. So for those of you who are watching this for extra credit, which is probably most of you, if you're interested in what you see here tonight, please come and join us in Comms 111 on the debate team. Now the topic for tonight. The topic is counterterrorism policy. And the students on the debate team have been researching this topic all year long. And for those of you who are a part of Professor Anderson's class, you have also been studying this all year long. But for tonight, we are focusing on general US counterterrorism policy and how it affects us here at home and internationally. Now, let me introduce our wonderful panelists for the evening. First, we have Dr. Maha Hilal, who is the founding executive director of Muslim Counterpublics Lab, a researcher and writer on institutionalized Islamophobia, and author of the book Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. Her writings have appeared in Vox, Middle East Eye, Newsweek, Business Insider, and many, many more. So thank you so much, Dr. Maha Hilal, for joining us. Second, we have Mr. David Bowker. I hope I am pronouncing everyone's names correctly. If I'm not, feel free to just let me know and I will fix it. We have Mr. David Bowker, who is a partner at a global law firm, WilmerHale, where he is the chair of international litigation practice and handles a wide range of complex disputes. Before arriving at the firm nearly 20 years ago, he was the attorney advisor for the law of armed conflict at the US Department of State. And then finally, we have Miss Shay Khan. Shay is one of our professors here at is one of our lecturers here at Sacramento State and a professor, goodness gracious, and a professor at Sacramento City College with a background in international relations and organizational communication. She is one of our beloved coaches and has spent this season helping the Hornet debate team with research around counterterrorism policy regarding the AUMF and 127E programs. Goodness gracious. In the interest of time, we're going to be aiming for about 2 minutes per answer. Lovely panelists, just so you know, once you reach about 2 minutes on your answer, I will put my little hand up like so, my virtual little hand, of course, just to let you know visually that we're hitting about 2 minutes. So with all of that being said, let's finally get to our first question. So to begin our discussion about counterterrorism policy, we need to start with a basic but important question. What is terrorism? The term itself is used in a lot of different ways: domestic terrorism, stochastic terrorism, foreign terrorism. But what makes one act of violence terrorism, whereas another act is not? And is there a meaningful definition between the two? So first, let's start with Mr. Bowker, since you are right on the left of me in the Zoom screen.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me as part of this discussion. I think, it's a great question to start with. It's very hard to define terrorism because I think we all recognize that the international community has had trouble agreeing on what the definition should be, and it's partially a result of the definition really hinging on one's perspective and one's position with respect to the issue. So I think it has confounded international law experts since the term was created. And I guess you could go back at least 70 years where nations have been attempting to agree upon a definition. There are definitions in national laws, but very few settled definitions in international laws. I would start in US law, I would start with the definition that's set forth in the Anti-Terrorism Act. That act reflects years of jurisprudence and legislative study of the issue, and is fairly well settled as a matter of US law. Both international terrorism is defined and domestic terrorism is defined there, and it's a good starting point. Internationally, you can start with the definition used by the International Law Commission. That's a definition that was borrowed and plugged into the first iterations of the Rome Statute, which is the basis for the International Criminal Court. The offense of terrorism wasn't actually included in the final version of the Rome Statute, but the iterative drafts that included the definition of terrorism generally reflect the International Law Commission definition. And basically, it is more or less the use of violence to terrorize particular governments, particular groups, or particular publics. And it's to do so to influence policy or action by the government of the group. And there are lots of variations on that, but that's, I think, the gist of it. And I'll look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists about their views on this, because I think it's a tricky question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bowker. Moving on to the next person I can see on my Zoom screen, Dr. Hilal, if we could have your thoughts as well.
Sure. Well, like David, I think we can all agree that it is a very complicated term, but my short answer would be that terrorism is whatever, it's whatever usually the state defines it as. And whoever has the power to construct what terrorism is what the definition is. We know that there are a lot of problems with that way of constructing terrorism. Typically, it's defined as non-state actor violence that causes fear, that targets civilians, and is done, of course, as David mentioned, right, with the aim of influencing policy. But if we're looking at objectively, what are the harms of the violence that we refer to as terrorism, it is often indistinguishable from state violence. And so the definition of terrorism is obviously laced with social construction and is weaponized by the state to leverage and legitimize its own violence. So that, this becomes a problem in terms of, I know that a follow-up question is about counterterrorism, so I won't answer that now. But essentially, the state gets to define. Whoever has the power, whoever has more power in the equation is whoever gets to define what counts as terrorism and therefore what the appropriate response is to it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hilal. Miss Shay, if
You
we
can
could
just call me Shay, it's fine.
Oh, sorry,
Well, Dr. Hilal and David actually did a really good job of diving into the factors that complicate the definition. I think, put succinctly, right, terrorism, if you're just looking at the action, is a violent action to some degree inciting terror, right, for a political motive. And usually most textbooks will include that it's by a non-state actor. So what already makes this complicated is that you're attaching an actor to an action inherently in a definition, which is what makes it sticky. And then by those definitions, right? And then also, because there's a very subjective qualifier in there, what incites terror? At what point what is the litmus test for terror? These are just two basic things in a very charged definition that make it complicated. I think that it's really important, though, to just add and kind of prime you all for some of the things that we'll be talking about later, that there are some really important differences between a state actor and a non-state actor. And without getting into too much like gross political theory, we don't have the time for it anyway. Basically, a state is defined by a trifecta of a monopoly on force, authority, and legitimacy, and non-state actors don't have access to all three at the same level that state actors do. So typically, the political action that they're looking for or looking to incite is something that they don't have access to, but the state does have access to a larger degree than them. And I'll stop my answer there.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shay. Moving on, let's go ahead and move to our second question. As a follow-up, with a better understanding of what terrorism is, what would an ethical counterterrorism policy look like? Is there an ethical approach to counterterrorism in the US government? And what role do individuals in the US and around the world have in dealing with terrorism? I also just want to acknowledge that Dr. Hilal is just grabbing a charger. She'll be right back. So let's go ahead and have Shay answer first this time, since you're right there.
Oh, you got me all flustered. I thought I had time to bring you. That's okay. So what is important in understanding what ethical counterterrorism approach looks like, it's important to understand, right, the difference between the state and a non-state actor, and the fact that the US is just trying to engage on a military level or on some forceful level, a state versus a non-state actor. And so the factors that make the rules of engagement ethical also have an effect here to some degree, right? In under convention, right, under the AUMF, there has to be a feeling of acting in defense. And that is generally what people feel makes war on at least one actor's part ethical. And so the same thing kind of applies for non-state actors as well. But the difference is the things that non-state actors have access to are often not as stable that actors have access to. So for example, organizations or organizational structures in terrorist groups are often more volatile, and it's even the larger ones that end up becoming threats to the United States, enough so for us to have counter-terror policy towards them, are still relatively volatile compared to a state actor. And so the only way to really engage someone who doesn't have a lot of diplomatic means, and we have a harder time engaging them financially, the only way that we can really engage them is through violence or through force. And so the question is sticky, right? Just like everything is. What does ethical look like when you're looking at something that basically only comes down to force And my only answer is, just like with any war, there has to feel like there's some feeling of defense, but then that plays into a larger question of threat construction. And do we feel like there is an actual threat because there is an actual threat, or is it just being used to justify war because that is how most people feel war is justified ethically?
Okay, thank you so much, Shay. Mr. Bowker, if we could get your thoughts next.
Thank you. What would an ethical counterterrorism policy look like? I think we need to start with which agency or instrumentality of the state we're talking about as the implementer of counterterrorism policy, because the rules can be very different. And I think the rules that we're talking about are really, for government actors, the rule of law. And ideally, the rule of law reflects ethical considerations, that those ethical considerations are built into the laws that are enacted. When those ethical considerations are missing from the law, then the law comes up short in ensuring an effective and humane and decent counterterrorism policy that accomplishes the state's objectives, but doesn't result in unnecessary suffering or inhumanity, as the terms are used in the law of armed conflict and in counterterrorism. So just thinking about what agencies might be involved, I think it's important to distinguish between military agencies and non-military or civilian agencies, which tend to be law enforcement or maybe also intelligence agencies, but generally law enforcement agencies as opposed to military agencies. The military agencies, the use of force is permitted, but under strict rule of law conditions. So those basic conditions would be that the targets have to be of military necessity, in this case of counterterrorism military necessity, that any use of force has to be proportionate to the harm or the threat posed by terrorism, that there would have to be distinguishing between terrorist targets and non-terrorist or civilian civilians or civilian assets, civilian property, so that the military is only targeting those engaged in terrorism and the instruments of terrorism. And then there are additional rules about limitations on unnecessary suffering and the need for humanity in the rules. And those ethical rules about unnecessary suffering and humanity are embedded in the law of armed conflict, both internationally and domestically. So those are the military rules. On the civilian side, obviously, each country is different, but in this country, on the civilian side, there are very strict rules about what law enforcement agencies are permitted to do. The Bill of Rights apply either directly to the federal government or indirectly through the 14th Amendment to state governments or subdivisions of state governments. So at every level of government in this country, there are fundamental rights that are protected in the fight against terrorism. I think what we see, circling back to the question of whether counterterrorism approach is ethical or not, I think we see unethical counterterrorism policies when we see violations of fundamental rights. And, this happens, and we've seen it before, not only in our country, but in a lot of countries where, because of the threat posed by terrorism and because of the elements of fear and retribution and all of the other things, discrimination that go into state action when the state's not following the rule of law, there can be problems. And so I guess I would hold our government at every level to the standard of rule of law and to the extent that standard doesn't include ethics, we should amend the legislation, because certainly ethical considerations should always be part of the law and often are. And I think in this country are indeed, at least on paper and in theory, embedded in our law. And when those laws are carried out faithfully, I think we do a much better job than when we stray from those laws and commit violations.
Thank you, Mr. Bowker. Dr. Hilal, you're up next.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, namely because of the first question that was asked. And obviously, when you say the term counterterrorism, it implies that there's an accepted definition of terrorism, which we already talked about, right, as being socially constructed, and in many ways is actually tautological, right? Terrorism is violence committed by terrorists. That's essentially what the definition has boiled down to. And so when you use the phrase counterterrorism, you're essentially allowing and giving yourself the power, right, to define everything as a counter to this phrase and term that you've defined. So, in that sense, I'm not sure that there is an ethical counterterrorism policy. I don't know what that would actually look like. And I think it's important to note also that whenever the phrase counterterrorism is used and whenever policies are described as or are just counterterrorism policies, usually what it means is that, the solution to whatever violence it's in response to is brute force. And it precludes any other interventions, particularly any that would look at root causes of conflict. Why are acts of violence happening in the first place, to which we need to respond or feel that we need to respond? So I think that that's really important. And obviously, my frame of reference has been for the last 20 years, the war on terror. And we know in the US-led war on terror, counterterrorism has been weaponized specifically to legitimize and justify all the violence that has been committed post 9/11 in the name of fighting terrorism. And so it's a way of the US concealing its crimes and its violence, is to say that this is counterterrorism and everything we're doing is to fight terrorists. Everything we're doing is about justice. Everything we're doing is about, retribution. So I think that, there's I guess I would say I don't know what an ethical approach to counterterrorism for the US government would be, because, the history of the United States government is that it doesn't usually interact with or solve problems in any sort of ethical way whatsoever. This country is laced and rooted in violence, and, from the country's inception to now. And so I don't know, I literally cannot think of an example in which this country has interacted with, engaged with a public policy problem, especially concerning violence coming from without or even within the country, where there has been an ethical approach. And, one of the last things I'll say is that when it comes to domestic terrorism, for example, we've seen increasingly the pressure to implement domestic terrorism laws, specifically to address the rise of I don't even know if it's a rise, but the increased recognition that white extremist violence is a problem. And even that in of itself is violent, because essentially what risks happening, and it has already happened, is that it's being used to further target Muslims and other members of BIPOC communities, not actually white supremacists who enact all sorts of violence. So if the United States, if we, as I understand it, is not necessarily a country that's built on any sort of actual commitment to ethics or principles, this is different than what's perhaps said on paper and in the rhetoric, then I don't think that there is such a thing and that there could be ethical counterterrorism. And again, recognizing that the term counterterrorism is indeed a problem in and of itself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hilal. So moving on to our third question, having just mentioned the war on terror, in response to the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001, carried out by Al-Qaeda, the United States drastically changed its counterterrorism policy. This included the start of what was called the war on terror. How much of this policy response has been influenced by Islamophobia? And how much has the war on terror contributed to Islamophobia? Dr. Hilal, I know that this is part of your book. So if you would like to give your thoughts first.
Sure, absolutely. So the war on terror is indeed deeply entrenched with Islamophobia, and that is something that I argue in my book and work that I've been invested in for many years now, and really underscoring and mainstreaming this Islamophobia analysis. That is to say that if we want to understand the war on terror, and in particular how to push back against it and dismantle it, then it is indeed necessary and imperative to understand the role of Islamophobia. When Bush first used the term war on terror, what he essentially meant is that this war would be nebulous, unending, and that the tactics at the US's disposal to fight back against this terrorist threat would exist without any barriers whatsoever. You know, if you look at the rhetoric, and this is something I do in the course of my book, if you look at the rhetoric across administrations in terms of how much of the blame is laid on the average Muslim, you can see differences between Bush, Obama, and Trump, obviously with Trump being the most explicitly Islamophobic. At the same time, the rhetoric is different than what was actually happening on the ground. And it goes without saying that the policies that Bush implemented under the guise of the war on terror, which were deeply Islamophobic, were perpetuated by Obama and then perpetuated by Trump. They all built off of one another. So not only has the war on terror been a project of Islamophobia, it is a bipartisan effort that has existed since the inception of the war on terror. When Bush first used that term on September 20th of 2001. There are numerous examples, right, that we can look to. For example, if we look at Guantanamo Bay Prison, which is an area of particular focus that I've spent a lot of years researching and writing about and advocating against. And when we look at Guantanamo, we see how there was an entirely separate legal system created for these Muslim men that were detained at Guantanamo. In fact, the prison, of course, as we know, is an exclusively Muslim male prison. It has never housed post 9/11 anyone who wasn't Muslim. So if we wanted an example of what institutionalized Islamophobia looks like and what epitomizes it, Guantanamo Bay is indeed a great example of that. And in addition to creating this, entirely different legal system, this has also happened domestically, where we had domestic terrorism cases, although at the time, and the United States has fluctuated in terms of what's referred to as foreign and international terrorism versus domestic terrorism. There are technical definitions, but at the root of that, needless to say, are again constructions of what is deemed terrorism. And it has impacted Muslims in every sphere of life. In my book, and I know I'm running up against time, in my book, I develop a taxonomy of the war on terror, of which there are 5 dimensions. This includes militarism and warfare, draconian immigration policies, surveillance, federal terrorism prosecutions, and detention and torture. And every single one of those dimensions is deeply laced with Islamophobia. And what does that mean? It means that there is differential targeting of Muslims by virtue of their religious identity, that there are different consequences when Muslims, at least sometimes, commit acts of violence, as there would be if someone who wasn't Muslim commits an act of violence. There are different policy burdens based on particular constructions. And post 9/11, when we go back to, again, this construction of terrorism, Muslims have been constructed as uniquely terroristic and violent. And that's another issue and another problem with the way that terrorism has been defined, in that it conflates, Muslim and terrorists are conflated such that even if we were to adapt or adopt a quote, objective term, because of how closely it has been attributed to Muslims, it simply doesn't stick when we apply it to other groups. So the whole war on terror has been deeply embedded in Islamophobia. And, people treat the war on terror as though the targeting of Muslims was unintended or coincidental. And as I demonstrate in my book, this is not just a feeling. It's not about a perception. There are empirical ways we can measure, in fact, the targeting of Muslims in terms of how, again, there has been differential policy burdens imposed on Muslims by virtue, again, of their religious identity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hilal. Shay, Why don't you give your thoughts next?
Yes, of course. I will be honest, the first time that I heard the question or read the question, I was initially taken aback because there was a tiny part of me that was a little offended that we're assuming that Islamophobia or Islam and terror are linked. But of course, being realistic and taking it contextually in our culture, of course they are. And Dr. Hilal does a really great job of explaining the narrative that goes behind that. I think that to kind of take it back to basics, engaging anyone in conflict historically has required a history or at least a buildup of otherization. And I think that the Islamic world is particularly prone to this. It kind of becomes an easier target. One, just because it's sheer size, it's one of the larger religions in the world. I want to say usually you determine the threat of something or your response to something both by size, and then you determine if it's going to be a positive or negative response. And so just the sheer size of it makes it a little bit of an easier target. But also the distance, especially before we lived in a more globalized era where it seems like we're a little bit closer than we were before, just the sheer distance, and then the cultural differences. There are stark differences. Of course, those build up towards, if you are interested in looking at Orientalism or the term Orientalism or any literature by Edward Said, that kind of becomes the building block for what the modern era narrative is towards the Islamic world. Surely that's where the spotlight is now, despite the fact that most states will argue that any terrorist organization, like by their definition, right, could be anyone, right? But of course, it's hard to ignore that the spotlight is on the Muslim world. And I would say that narrative has been building probably since, at least in more recent history, I want to say the 60s, 70s, leading up to the revolution in Iran. A lot of this is built up, one, because there does kind of need to feel like a threat, or at least it's useful to the war on terror, because there does need to feel like there's a threat, and there does need to feel like the other person deserves, or the other peoples deserve, or the other organization deserves whatever violence is about to be inflicted. But I mean, of course, I'll leave some space for David to speak, but yes, they are linked, and it has been something that's built up over time. However, they're impossible to separate now, and our current policies now just feed Islamophobia and the more political spotlight that those particular policies get, the more we may feed it. However, it is possible, I think, to at least start detaching ourselves and to try, even if they're impossible to separate from one another.
Thank you, Shay. Mr. Bowker?
Thank you. This is a very interesting question, and one that I've thought a lot about. I was in government when 9/11, the attacks of 9/11 occurred. I was engaged in U.S. counterterrorism work at the National Security Council staff in the 1990s, and then at the State Department in the 1990s and early 2000s. And when the attacks occurred in 2001, I was the law of armed conflict attorney at the Department of State. So these attacks were very much relevant to my responsibilities in government. And one of the very first questions that arose was whether these attacks were acts of war, whether they were criminal acts, how they should be treated. And I mean, not to focus too much on the label, but I never personally liked or thought it was wise to use the label war on terror or war on terrorism, because it's I think as Dr. Hilal said, nebulous and unending. I didn't like that because as a law of armed conflict expert, I think it's important to have clear beginnings and endings, clear rules of engagement, and clear lines of when the use of force can be used militarily and when only civilian law enforcement assets can be used to address a problem. I think we all recognize that military force is a blunt instrument. And unfortunately, it's very, very hard to use an instrument that blunt in a way that is nuanced, in a way that is complex. And so I just thought that was a mistake from the start, that labeling. Now, I will say to the core of the question, you know, how much of this policy response has been influenced by Islamophobia? Well, there's no question that our society suffers from Islamophobia the same way that every society suffers from its phobias. We certainly have that one. Obviously, not everyone has it. I don't think we can paint with a broad brushstroke that the government is necessarily Islamophobic. I don't think that's right. It wasn't true in my experience in government. But certainly we have this problem as a society that needs to be addressed. I think what's interesting is before the attacks on 9/11, counterterrorism policy was very much not exclusively focused on the Islamic world. It just wasn't. Terrorist threats were arising from a lot of different corners of the world, including from different communities in our own country. I think the attacks of 9/11, because of the nature of those attacks, who conducted them, where they were from, and the fact that they were Muslims, created a problem culturally for us, which is that counterterrorism policy necessarily in the aftermath of that became very focused on that particular threat. And where did that threat arise? It arose in particular countries, from particular places. And so geography and geopolitics played into it. I think Islamophobia did as well, but I think there were very, very big geopolitical, geographic, and a larger international political economy type factors at work. I mean, we know where the threat arose, we know where force was being used, and that drove a lot of the counterterrorism policy. So I don't think it was exclusively that problem that we've identified, but that was certainly a problem.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bowker, excuse me. Moving on to our next question. In 2013.
Sorry, I just want to add one thing, which is, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Just to add one quick thing. The use of Guantanamo Bay, the use of what they called enhanced interrogation techniques, but which I think were used in a way that was, I think rather obviously torture. Those decisions and those instruments were a huge mistake. I think probably not lawful in many ways, and more than that, not only violative of our laws and our principles, but also unethical. And I wouldn't for a moment defend those decisions. And in fact, some of those decisions are very closely related to why I left government. But I will say that there were lots of aspects of counterterrorism and counterterrorism policy in the United States government that were entirely rule of law driven and entirely ethical, and something we could be very proud of. But there was also a lot that was wrong and done poorly and needed to be fixed.
Could I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just because David made me think. So, I think when we're talking about the question of Islamophobia, I still believe that it's the war on terror has been deeply entrenched with Islamophobia, but I also know that there are other factors that can have contributed to the war's never ending. Basically, just the fact that it's never ending and nebulous. However, the U.S. government has gone to great lengths to criminalize and target Muslims beyond. When we talk about a proportionate response, I mean, there are numerous examples of how Muslims have been targeted beyond what would be considered proportionate, if we can even agree to that sort of framing, because it is pretty dehumanizing in my opinion. And so I think that that's a problem. And I think when you're dealing with policies and laws that are giving the impression that there is Islamophobia at play, it's probably rooted in some truth, right? And in my book, I talk about numerous policies, again, along the 5 dimensions, of which really clearly targeted Muslims. There was no other, target other than Muslims. And I think people sometimes get confused because policies are often neutral on their face. And it's only when it comes to implementation that you can see who is actually the target or the intended target of the policies. And then, when it comes to Guantanamo, I mean, to me, again, I do think it's in the epitome of Islamophobia. And I think to me that the greatest test is, there was a CIA torture report that came out by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in 2014. And some of the questions that were asked by opinion polls around that time were, for example, do you think that basically the treatment that was discussed in the report was justified or unjustified? I literally cannot imagine those questions being asked if it was, for example, a group of white Christian men that were being tortured at Guantanamo. I cannot imagine. And in fact, 49% of those surveyed said it was justified. And so these questions aren't asked, but that doesn't mean we often can't deduce what the response would be. And we can deduce that because it's simply not happening. There's never going to be a prison, an offshore illegally housed prison that detains white Christian men, even if they committed the worst crimes. It's just not going to happen in the context of the country that we live in right now. And so I think, to me, there are different ways we can think about and have to critically examine the role of Islamophobia. Because even when we talk about enhanced interrogation, the phrase, what we're describing is torture. It's flat out torture. I've not read anything that would not make me believe that what was described as enhanced interrogation was just simply and basically explicitly torture. And again, this ties to Islamophobia, because if we were to read what was described as enhanced interrogation techniques and think about another group that it was being applied to, such as white Christian men, we would undoubtedly call that treatment torture.
Thank you, Dr. Hilal and Mr. Bowker, for your thoughts on that last question. Moving on to, I think, what will be our last question of the night, just with how lovely this discussion has been. Our final question for the night is, can you offer some thoughts about how those in academia at any level can better teach our students about these issues? Shay, if you would be willing to share your thoughts first.
Yes, of course. So as my place is in academia, I give this question actually quite a lot of thought, especially because a lot of this year we've been peeling back this issue, but also because I was raised in a Muslim household, and a lot of counterterror policy and a lot of attitudes towards Islam and the relationship between that and counterterror policy and our understandings of those policies are inherently linked. It's affected not only just my lens and my frame of understanding policy, my identity, but also the way that I engage with my students. And so it's really difficult for me to pinpoint one single place or two single places that we could reframe these issues, or that we could spotlight certain issues over others, because it is a really complex issue. And on one level, for me, it's very personal, and it starts at the interpersonal level, the way that I engage my students, the way that I validate identities, the way that I frame legitimate actions or actors, the way that we talk about ethics. But I think that a really important start for at least undergraduate students or students who are just starting their development or understanding of policy or international relations or war is to understand the importance of subjectivity and to understand the usage of standards. So earlier, David talked about what in international law and what in US law technically qualifies as ethical terms of engagement. And those standards, how they're applied, and once we apply them, can we continue to do better? I challenge my students to establish standards and really have a strong philosophical and ethical understanding of where they would like to stand before they start looking at whether actions are good or bad. In addition, and that's just something I struggle with in my regular public speaking classes, so I can't even imagine how we start to untangle that in terms of really complex international policy. But that's where I would want them to start. In addition to that, I'd like them to, on a more personal note, understand the interpersonal and identity issues that can be tied to violence, that can be tied to policy, and to understand how just not even on an academic level, but on a very personal level, the way that they view each other, and it doesn't have to be another Muslim student, it could just be a different student, right? The way that they view each other, the way they engage each other, and the way that they filter information about and from each other eventually has an impact on the rest of their engagement with the world. On every level, and it may very well be the case that these students end up going into policy making, and it is really I would be amiss to say that there is no bias that leaks into policy and the government that doesn't exist within culture. So in order for us to have better policy making, even if you're not going into policy in the future, you need to have better discussions, which requires better insight and a higher standard for ethics and conversation.
Thank you very much, Shay. Mr. Bowker, why don't we hear from you next?
Thanks. Great question. I think the most important thing that academia can do is to teach people how to think about these issues. And it's not so much that there needs to be a particular doctrine or a particular way to think about these issues, but just how to think broadly, which categories of things to think about, and how to work one's way through those issues in a linear way would help a lot. I think it would be good with these particular issues because of the subject matter. It'd be good to start with the law. I think given that our system is a rules-based system and is a rule of law system, it's important to know the relevant laws, not only what they are, but let's think about what they should be, how they can be changed, whether they should be changed, how to know if they should be changed. We ought to be looking not only at what they are, but what they could and should be. So, that would be one component of teaching about this, would be the legal component. It's certainly not the only one. I think it's also very, very important to teach that if we're going to have a rules-based system and a rule of law system, there needs to be an element of good faith, a good faith application of law, a good faith adherence to law. And this is embedded in our Constitution. It doesn't say that the president must follow the law. It's that the president must take care that the laws be faithfully executed, not just executed, but faithfully executed. The reason we ran into trouble with turning this sort of crazy enhanced interrogation program out, and it resulted in torture, I think, very predictably, is because we had lawyers making arguments that, okay, there was some colorable case for the argument. There was some plausible argument to be made, but it wasn't in good faith. It wasn't faithful to the underlying laws and principles. And that needs to be part of what we teach, which is the rules are X. Here's how you change them if you think they need to be changed. And what's key is you have to implement them and execute them in good faith. And then I think the last thing is to teach people that in counterterrorism in particular, or in war in particular, it's critically important that our public servants and our public have the courage, basically have the courage of their convictions to stand up to violations or bad faith violations of the law or bad faith applications of the law, so that we're standing up and we're holding ourselves to the standard that we set in our rules. And I think if we did those things, if we, in teaching, if we focused on what the law is, what it means to execute or implement law, or to defend the law in good faith, and then to stand up to violations and bad faith behavior, we'd have a better, more effective counterterrorism policy. We'd have a better, more effective use of force policy, and we would be truer to our ideals. And so I think teaching's so important to establish the foundations so that we behave in a way that's truer to our ideals. So I'm grateful that you've initiated this discussion, because I think it is important to teach about these issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bowker. And then Dr. Hilal, if we could hear your thoughts as well, please.
Well, let me just quick start with an anecdote, which is that, when I was doing my PhD at American University, one of the classes I took, we had to read a book that I think was called Terrorism and Public Policy. And in the book, it expressly said that there is no single religious group that's responsible for committing acts of terrorism. And after that, there were sections on each of maybe 12 different religions. And, although that was the point that was made before that section, all the religions minus Islam was about a page in length. And when it came to Islam, that section was 12 pages. And I say that because obviously when you're lengthening the section on one particular religious group, to say that it's not unique to one religious group seems to be kind of a misnomer. And I also say that to say, because I think this question somewhat implies that there is a general neutrality in terms of how counterterrorism is approached, and that's just categorically false. I think you can, as David suggested, think about what would be a good faith effort of the application of the law and teach as such. However, good faith is not as applicable when you're talking about a population and groups of people that have been so thoroughly dehumanized that good faith might mean torturing them, right? And this is not meant to be a blanket statement, but when you're just talking about groups, again, that have been so targeted, so demonized, so dehumanized, it's a whole different calculation. I think, when it comes to academia, and just in my experience, there are a lot of academic institutions, professors alike, that are deeply embedded within the state apparatus of counterterrorism. And in my own experience, again, I was rather marginalized because I was trying to push back against some of the problematic aspects that I saw within the counterterrorism paradigm. And so I think if we're truly going to be honest and ethical and principled about how we teach these kind of topics, then I think it is actually about allowing different viewpoints to exist. And I know that when people express viewpoints, particularly those that are critical of state violence, they are often maligned and silenced. And as students, that can be very disempowering, right? Because you're also dealing with power dynamics with, professors, academic institutions, centers, et cetera. So I think that really encouraging a very honest and open and like context where there's not going to be any repercussions. I also think, I can suggest a couple of specific resources that I think are very helpful in terms of understanding specifically academia's role in perpetuating this problematic national security paradigm, one of which is called a Jihadism Anti-Primer, and I can send them maybe to you, Kelly, and a book called Disciplining Terror as well. And also in my own book, I talk extensively about the national security and counterterrorism paradigm that has permeated our understanding of what terrorism looks like, who essentially does terrorism post 9/11. And in thinking about these critical questions, especially around how so much of this issue falls to the ways that the issue is constructed and who is constructed as the problem, I think those are some of the most critical questions that we have to answer, not just in terms of what are the actual laws and policies that are on paper, but what are allowing those laws and policies to exist in the first place. And in my research, a huge part of that has been the dehumanization of Muslims.
Thank you so much for your thoughts, Dr. Hilal. And that takes us to exactly 7:58 p.m., at least over here where I am. I understand it's a little later for some of our panelists, so I will make our conclusion somewhat quick. First of all, yes, Dr. Hilal, I would love for you to send those resources to me. As a future instructor, I want to do the best that I can, and I will make sure that those resources are available to the rest of the team and anybody who wants them as well. Thank you so much for our panelists for joining us tonight. This was a wonderful discussion, and I think that we've had some wonderful conversations, and there are some really good nuggets of information in there for everybody to know. And then for those of you, mainly just the students, if any of our panelists are interested, I can tell you the trivia question after we're done. But for those of you students who are looking for the answer to a special trivia question for your homework, the answer is Lewis Tomlinson. Yes, the One Direction member. But thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you again to our panelists. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.